The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. I'm Kora Thomas, 28 years old, and I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further. I am not someone who falls apart easily. 6 years in the military will do that to you. You learn to compartmentalize. You learn to tuck things away in neat little boxes and seal them shut and keep moving. It's a survival skill, and for most of my adult life, I thought it was a strength. The envelope had a return address I recognized: David Brennan, attorney at law. I knew the name. He had handled my grandfather's estate. He was the kind of man who wore the same style of suit every day and spoke in measured, careful sentences that never wasted a single word. My grandmother had mentioned him once, maybe twice. The kind of mention you don't follow up on because nothing in your family ever felt urgent enough to investigate. I left it sitting there. I made coffee in the morning and walked past it. I came home after evening runs with Jake and set my keys down next to it without picking it up. There was something in me that already understood, on some animal level, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to cost me something. I just hadn't decided yet if I was ready to pay. Jake noticed it on the second night. He was sitting at my kitchen table eating leftover rice and barely looking up when he said, "You going to open that?" Eventually I said. He didn't push. That's one of the things I love about Jake Morrison. He knows the difference between support and pressure, and he never confuses them. We'd met 8 months earlier at a veteran support group downtown, the kind of gathering where everyone sits in a circle and says things they can't say anywhere else. He was 31, former Army, with a dry humor that caught me off guard and a stillness about him that felt rare. We'd been careful with each other, both of us carrying the particular wariness that comes from having survived things you don't fully talk about yet. On the third morning, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note from my grandmother, Eleanor, and beneath it, a folded letter from David Brennan explaining that she had asked him to forward these materials to me directly, without going through my parents. Beneath that was a stack of documents. I didn't read them right away. I read my grandmother's note first, 3 times, because her handwriting had gotten shaky in the last few years, and I wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly. Kora, my darling. There are things I should have told you sooner. I am sorry it took me this long to find the courage. Read everything David has included. Then call me. I love you. My grandfather had set up an education trust before he died. I had known about this in a vague, general way, the way you know about things in your family that adults discussed in half sentences when you were a child. He had loved both his granddaughters. He had wanted both of us to have opportunities. The trust, I had been told when I turned 18, was intended to help with college. What I had not known, what I was only now at 28 learning, was that the original trust document specified $200,000 for me and $200,000 for my younger sister, Madison. What had actually happened to my $200,000 was something else entirely. I set the documents down on the table. I looked out the window at the gray morning sky. I thought about the day I enlisted, at 18, sitting across from a recruiter who asked me why I wanted to serve. I had given him the patriotic answer, the clean answer. But the real answer, the one I had never said out loud, was simpler, because there was no money for college, and no one in my family had offered me another path. I thought about how my parents had sat across from me that summer and told me the trust funds were depleted. A bad investment, my father Richard had said, looking somewhere past my shoulder. The market had been difficult. There wasn't enough left to justify using it for school. He said it in that tone he used for financial conversations, calm, authoritative, brooking no questions. I hadn't asked any. Not a single one. Even now, sitting at that table at 28 with the documents spread out in front of me, part of me still wanted to find an explanation. Not because I was naive, but because the alternative, the thing the documents were clearly pointing toward, was the kind of truth that doesn't just hurt. It reorganizes everything. Every memory. Every story you told yourself about your own life. I reached for my phone. I didn't call my grandmother yet. I called Jake. "Can you come over?" I said. He arrived in 20 minutes. He sat down across from me, looked at the documents without touching them, and then looked at me. "Tell me what it says," he said. I told him. "Let me go back." Let me go back to the place where the story actually starts, which is not the moment I opened that envelope, but the years before it, the years that look ordinary from the outside and feel ordinary when you're living them, but contain, if you look carefully, 100 small signals you kept finding reasons to dismiss. I grew up in a comfortable house in a quiet suburb, the older of 2 daughters. My father, Richard Thomas, was an accountant who had built a modest but stable career and who presented himself to the world with the measured confidence of a man who has never had serious cause to doubt his own judgment. My mother, Patricia, was the kind of woman who managed a household with the precision of a project coordinator and who communicated her preferences through tone and implication rather than direct statement. She could express disappointment without ever identifying herself as disappointed. Madison was 4 years younger than me. She was blonde where I was darker, soft where I was angular, instinctively social where I had always been more interior. I want to be careful here, because I didn't resent my sister as a child, not exactly. What I felt was more subtle than resentment. I felt the particular invisibility of the child who is told, constantly and in 100 quiet ways, that she does not require attention because she is capable of managing without it. "You're so strong, Kora." My mother said this the way other people say "you're so beautiful," as a compliment that closes the door rather than opening it. "You're so strong" meant, "we don't need to worry about you." "You're so strong" meant, "your needs are not urgent." "You're so strong" meant, eventually, your needs are not real. I watched Madison receive things I didn't know I wanted until I noticed I wasn't getting them. A tutor when she struggled with math. A car at 16, used but reliable. My parents attending every school play she was in, sitting in the front row. These were not extravagant things. But I tracked them the way children track fairness, with a precision that adults underestimate and a silence that adults mistake for acceptance. I was 16 when I first heard the word trust in relation to our grandfather's estate. My grandfather, a quiet man who had made a career in civil engineering and saved with the discipline of someone who had grown up without much, had died the previous winter. I remember my grandmother's face at the funeral, composed in a way that looked nothing like composure, the way grief looks when someone has been preparing themselves for a long time. At dinner one evening, my father mentioned that Grandpa had set up something for the girls' futures. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, as if the details were self-evident. I remember feeling something lift in my chest. A small warmth. A sense of being included. By the time I was 18 and sitting across the kitchen table from my parents in August, 2 weeks before the fall semester would begin, that warmth had been replaced by something colder. My father explained that the investment account tied to the trust had not performed well. The funds were largely depleted. There wouldn't be enough for 4 years of university, and taking out heavy student loans seemed unwise. He was calm. Reasonable. He used financial language I didn't have the vocabulary to challenge. My mother nodded along. She reached over and patted my hand once. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do." Looking back now, I understand that was the moment I should have called someone, my grandmother, a lawyer, anyone with actual knowledge of what that trust contained. But I was 18 and I believed my parents the way 18-year-olds believe their parents, not because I was foolish, but because the entire architecture of my understanding of the world was built on the assumption that they were operating in good faith. I enlisted 6 weeks later. The military gave me structure, purpose, a salary, and healthcare. It gave me discipline I already had and sharpened it until it became something close to armor. I deployed twice. I came back both times with something I couldn't easily name, not broken, exactly, but rearranged. The way a room looks different after you've moved the furniture. Everything technically the same, everything subtly wrong. During those years, Madison went to college. Not state school, a private university with a well-regarded business program. I heard about it in phone calls home, which I made dutifully every few weeks from wherever I happened to be stationed. My parents sounded happy on those calls. Madison was thriving. She'd joined a sorority. She had a professor who was mentoring her. The campus was beautiful. I told myself I was proud of her. I mostly was. What I didn't notice or noticed and chose not to examine was the texture of those phone calls. The way my parents asked about my deployment with the careful concern of people maintaining a performance, but asked about Madison with the unguarded warmth of genuine investment. The way my accomplishments were received with things like "that's good, honey," while Madison's were received with things like "we're so proud, we told everyone." The difference in temperature between those two types of response. The way one type makes you feel witnessed and the other makes you feel processed. I wasn't a victim in those years. I want to be clear about that. I was building something real: skills, character, of a record of service, a sense of myself as someone capable of surviving difficulty. I was not passive. I was, in the language my mother had always used about me, strong. But I had absorbed, over a lifetime, the lesson that my strength meant I did not require the same things as other people. I had stopped asking for what I couldn't see myself receiving. And that blind spot, that particular trained blindness, was the crack in the foundation that allowed everything else to happen. When I left the military at 24, I came home to a family that greeted me with warmth and relief, and a dinner my mother cooked that I didn't have the heart to tell her I didn't love anymore. Madison was finishing her undergraduate degree. She would go on to a master's program in business administration, funded, I assumed, by some combination of scholarships, loans, and our parents' support. I found an apartment. I started working in project management, first for a logistics firm, then freelancing, carving out a specialty in coordination and process optimization, skills the military had given me and civilian life had found a use for. I started a small mentorship program for veterans navigating the job market, something I'd been thinking about since my second deployment. Something that needed time and money I didn't quite have yet, but that felt like the truest version of what I wanted to do with whatever came next. Life was not unhappy. It was just quieter than I'd expected. Jake came into it 8 months before the envelope arrived. He had a way of asking questions that were actually observations in disguise, and one evening in my apartment, looking at a photo of my family on the refrigerator, he said something I hadn't expected. "Your sister's graduation party is next month," I'd told him. "MBA, big celebration. My parents are hosting." He looked at the photo for a moment. "Did your grandmother ever confirm the details of the trust?" he asked. "You said she was involved. Did she actually agree to whatever your parents told you?" I opened my mouth to answer and found that I couldn't. Because I had never asked her. The question sat inside me like a stone. It wasn't accusatory the way Jake had asked it. He was genuinely curious, not suspicious on my behalf, and that somehow made it worse. He wasn't planting doubt. He was simply asking about a piece of information that, when I tried to locate it in my memory, I realized I had always assumed rather than confirmed. I had been told the trust was depleted. I had believed the person who told me. I had never once gone to the source, to my grandmother, to the documents, to the attorney who had drafted them, and verified. I called Eleanor the next evening. My grandmother was 76 and lived alone in the house she and my grandfather had shared for 40 years, a 2-story colonial with a garden. She still tended herself with a stubbornness that doctors apparently found charming rather than alarming. She answered on the second ring. "Kora," she said, and her voice had that particular warmth it always had for me, the kind that doesn't have to perform itself because it's simply present. "Grandma," I said, "can I ask you something about Grandpa's trust?" A pause. Not a long one, but a pause that had texture, the texture of someone carefully choosing words. "What would you like to know?" she said. "Did you ever agree to change it? After Grandpa died, did anyone ask you to amend the terms?" Another pause. Longer this time. "David Brennan will be in touch with you soon," she said finally. "I've already spoken with him. There are things he'll explain better than I can on the phone. But Kora, no. I never agreed to anything." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after I hung up. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. I had the sensation of standing at the edge of something vast and looking down, unable to see the bottom. I didn't call my parents that night. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I walked into that conversation. Some instinct, honed, I suppose, by 6 years of situations where going in uninformed was the most dangerous option, told me to wait. The envelope arrived 4 days later. Those 4 days were among the stranger ones I'd experienced outside of deployment. I went through my normal routines: morning run, project work, and evenings spent at the Veterans Center where I'd been developing the mentorship curriculum, but everything had taken on a slightly unreal quality. The way familiar objects look strange when you're running a fever. I kept catching myself studying memories. Madison's college. Who had paid for it specifically in the years I'd been stationed elsewhere? I knew our parents had helped. I knew Madison had a very nice apartment near campus in her second year, nicer than I would have expected from a student budget. I knew she'd done a summer study abroad program in her junior year. These were not extraordinary things. They were the normal outlines of a supported student life. But they accumulated, in those 4 days, differently than they had before. I thought about the summer I came home on leave when I was 21 and noticed the kitchen had been completely renovated. New countertops, new appliances, a breakfast nook that hadn't existed before. My father mentioned something about a bonus from work. My mother showed me the new coffee maker with genuine delight. I thought about a conversation I'd had with my Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister, a wry and observant woman who had never quite fit into the family's preferred narrative of itself, at Christmas 2 years ago. She had said something offhand that I'd filed away without examining. Something about how it was nice that Madison's school had worked out, given everything. I had assumed she meant the difficulty of finding the right program. I hadn't asked her to elaborate. I thought about how, whenever I mentioned the Veterans Mentorship program I was building, the one I was funding from my own savings, slowly and carefully, my parents responded with vague encouragement that had the quality of waiting for the next topic. No specific questions. No offers. Just "that's wonderful, Kora," and then a pivot to whatever Madison was doing with her career. These thoughts were not evidence of anything. I understood that. Patterns can be confirmation bias. Connections can be the mind making meaning where there is none. I told myself this several times during those 4 days, trying to be fair. But I had also spent 6 years in an environment that taught me to distinguish between false alarms and real ones. And something in my body, that same animal intelligence that had gotten me through 2 deployments intact, was telling me this was not a false alarm. The documents David Brennan had included in the envelope were methodical. He was that kind of lawyer, everything organized, everything labeled, a brief explanatory note attached to each section. He had been my grandfather's attorney for 22 years. When my grandfather died, the trust had passed into my father's management as the designated trustee. David had continued as the trust's attorney of record. The original document was clear. $200,000 for Kora Thomas upon reaching 18 years of age or using funds for educational purposes. $200,000 for Madison Thomas under the same terms. The amendment, dated approximately 6 months after my grandfather's death, told a different story. It consolidated the trust. All $400,000 designated for educational use, redirectable at the trustee's discretion to the beneficiary deemed most likely to pursue academic study. The amendment bore my grandmother's signature. My grandmother, who had just told me on the phone that she had never agreed to anything. I looked at that signature for a long time. I looked at the way the letters formed. I had a card my grandmother had sent me when I finished my first deployment, signed with "All my love, Eleanor" in her particular looping cursive. I held the card next to the amended document. The signatures were not identical. They were close. Close enough that someone not looking carefully might not notice. But the E and Eleanor began differently. The I had a different lean. The spacing between the letters was slightly wrong in a way that felt forced rather than natural, the way handwriting looks when someone is copying rather than generating. I set both pieces of paper on the table and took a photograph of them side by side. Then I texted Jake, "Can you come over tonight? There's something I need to show you." Jake looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. "You need to call the attorney," he said finally. "I know. Before you call your parents." "I know." He looked up at me. "How are you?" It was such a simple question that it almost undid me. I had been holding myself in a particular careful posture for days, upright, contained, processing, and the directness of it created a crack I had to work to close. "I'm okay," I said. "I will be okay. I just need to understand the full picture before I do anything." I called David Brennan the next morning. He had expected my call, he said so, without elaboration, in a way that suggested he had been waiting for it for some time. "Miss Thomas," he said, "your grandmother came to me 3 months ago with serious concerns about the trust amendment. She does not believe that is her signature. She never authorized any change to the original document, and she was not present at any meeting where such a change was discussed. She came to me because she didn't know who else to trust with the information." He paused. "I've been conducting an informal review of the trust records since then. I want to share what I've found with you, with your permission. There are things you should know." What followed was one of the most quietly devastating conversations I have ever had. David walked me through the documents with the same calm precision I imagined he brought to all his work, but I could hear beneath the measured tone something that I can only describe as controlled anger. The particular anger of someone who has spent a career doing things correctly and has discovered that someone else used that career as cover for doing things very wrong. The original trust, $400,000, split equally. This was correct. The amendment, executed approximately 7 months after my grandfather's death. My father, as trustee, had submitted it. The amendment gave him discretionary authority to allocate the total sum to whichever granddaughter was actively pursuing education. He had certified it with what appeared to be my grandmother's signature as co-beneficiary consent. The subsequent withdrawals, $212,000 disbursed to Madison's educational expenses over 4 years. The remaining funds, approximately $188,000 at the time of full disbursement, had been transferred in 3 separate transactions to an account that, David explained carefully, bore my father's personal account number. Not the trust account. Not an educational institution. My father's personal account. Additionally, David said, your grandfather had a secondary investment account, separate from the main trust, that carried a designated inheritance sum of $50,000 for you specifically. This was documented in a separate letter of instruction to the estate. That transfer never occurred. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my notebook open and a pen in my hand. I had been taking notes, writing figures, tracking the shape of what he was describing. My handwriting was neat. My hand was steady. I noticed both these things from a slight distance, the way you notice details about yourself when the rest of you is somewhere else. So the total discrepancy, I said, is my $200,000 plus the personal transfers plus the $50,000 separate account. The full picture, David said, with a careful hesitation that I recognized as the pause of a professional who knows exactly what he's about to say, suggests that your father diverted the entirety of your designated share, forged your grandmother's signature to legally authorize the amendment, and also failed to transfer the separately designated inheritance. The combined figure approaches $450,000. I put the pen down. What are my options? I said. He outlined them. Civil recovery through the courts. A criminal complaint for forgery and breach of fiduciary duty, which would involve law enforcement. A combination of both. He was careful to present these as options, not recommendations, though I could hear in his framing which direction he thought was appropriate. Before you decide, he said, I'd suggest speaking with your grandmother. She's been carrying this for some time. She'll want to speak with you directly. I called Eleanor that afternoon. She answered immediately, as though she'd been sitting next to the phone. I've spoken with David, I said. Yes. A breath. Kora, I want you to know I was afraid. For a long time, I was afraid of what it would do to the family if I said anything. Your grandfather trusted Richard. I trusted Richard. And when I started to suspect something was wrong, I didn't know how to. I kept thinking I was wrong. That I'd missed something. That there was an explanation. I understood that feeling with more depth than I would have liked. How did you figure it out? I asked. Your Aunt Helen, she said. She noticed that your sister's school was very expensive and that you had enlisted instead of going to university. She asked me once, very carefully, whether I had understood that to be the arrangement. I didn't know what she meant at first. Then I went looking. Aunt Helen. The Christmas comment about everything working out for Madison's school. Another thing I had set aside without following. I sat with the full shape of it for several days before I told anyone else. I told Jake everything, and he listened with the focused attention he brought to all difficult things and then asked what I needed from him. I thought about going to my parents immediately. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to sit across from my father and watch his face when he understood I knew. But something else held me back, not forgiveness, not fear, but the particular patience of someone who understands that a confrontation without complete preparation is just a performance. I had watched enough things fall apart in the military from moving too quickly on incomplete information. Madison's MBA graduation party was in 11 days. My parents had rented a space at an event venue, a real celebration, invitations sent to family, friends, professors, colleagues. They had been planning it for months. My grandmother had been invited, as had Aunt Helen and many of Madison's peers and professors. I told David Brennan I would make a decision about legal proceedings after the party. He understood without asking why. In the days that followed, I did two things that I am not entirely comfortable examining now, though I stand behind both. First, I met with a civil litigation attorney to understand my legal position before any confrontation. Second, I called Aunt Helen. Helen was 62, sharp, with the slightly weathered look of someone who has always been slightly outside the main story and made peace with it. She came to meet me for coffee, and I told her what I knew. She was quiet for a long time. I always wondered, she said. I never had proof. I was afraid of being wrong. And Patricia, your mother would have made my life very difficult if I'd pushed. What did you see? I asked. The renovation. The cars. Madison's apartment when she was in school, that was not a student apartment, Kora. I visited once and I remember thinking, where is this money coming from? But you ask those questions in this family and you're told you're negative, you're unsupportive, you're jealous. She looked at her coffee cup. So I stopped asking. There was a lesson in that, in how a family can use the social cost of speaking up to enforce silence in the people who might otherwise notice the truth. I had paid a version of that cost myself every time I had not asked about the trust, every time I had accepted the explanation without verification because asking felt like accusing, and accusing felt like a kind of betrayal I wasn't ready to commit. I had been, in some way, protecting them, even as they were stealing from me. The night before the party, I sat alone in my apartment and read through the complete file of documents one more time. The original trust document. The amendment with the forged signature. The withdrawal records. The side-by-side photographs of my grandmother's genuine signature and the forgery. The separate account documentation showing the $50,000 that had never reached me. I put them in a folder. I put the folder in my bag. I called my grandmother. Are you sure you want to do this tomorrow? I asked her. I've been sure for 3 months, she said. I was just waiting until I had someone beside me who was also sure. The venue was exactly what my parents would have chosen, a private event room in an upscale restaurant, decorated with white flowers and framed photographs of Madison's academic journey. 40 or 50 guests, well-dressed, the kind of gathering that performs success back at the people attending it. Professors from Madison's MBA program. Colleagues of my father's. Family friends who had known us since we were children. Madison herself looked genuinely radiant. She was 24, wearing a cream-colored dress, working the room with the ease of someone who has always known which rooms she belongs in. I watched her across the space when I arrived and felt something complicated, not pure affection, not pure anger, but the layered ambivalence of loving a person who has, even unknowingly, been positioned at your expense. I had not told Madison what was coming. I wasn't certain she knew the full truth. The documents didn't clarify her role. It was possible she had simply received what she was told was hers, without knowing how it had been arranged. That uncertainty mattered to me. Whatever happened at this party was not intended to punish Madison, it was intended to end the concealment. My parents greeted me near the entrance with the warmth they always produced for public occasions. My father's handshake, his hand on my shoulder. My mother's kiss on the cheek, her comment about my dress. I returned both with the controlled pleasantness of someone who has had 6 years of training in keeping a face blank while the mind runs at full speed. My grandmother arrived 20 minutes after I did, escorted by Aunt Helen. Eleanor moved slowly these days, but her posture carried the particular uprightness of someone who has made a decision and is not retreating from it. She greeted guests quietly, accepted a glass of water, and found a chair near the center of the room. My father saw her and crossed the room to embrace her. I watched the embrace from where I was standing. There was something in the way he held himself afterward, a slight stiffness in the shoulders, something almost like relief, that told me he didn't suspect anything. He thought this was just a family gathering. He thought Eleanor was just an old woman at her granddaughter's party. I knew his psychology by then. He had spent a decade managing this situation through a combination of false authority and the assumption that no one would ever verify. The forgery had worked because no one had questioned the amendment at the time it was filed. The withdrawals had been processed through the trustee account with no flag because he was the trustee. The entire structure of the deception was built on the expectation that his family, especially the daughter he had characterized as strong enough to manage on her own, would never look too closely. That assumption was about to meet its consequence. My grandmother asked for the room's attention at what I would estimate was 45 minutes into the event, when the dinner had concluded and people were still seated at tables with drinks. She had asked Helen to arrange it. Helen had approached the host quietly. The host had tapped a glass, and the room quieted with the expectation of a toast. Eleanor stood. She thanked everyone for coming. She said she was proud of Madison. She meant it. I could hear that she meant it, and I believe Madison could too. Then she said, "There is also something I need to address, because I have stayed quiet about it for too long, and my conscience will not allow me to continue." The room's quality of attention changed. The specific silence of people who realize they are about to hear something they didn't expect. Eleanor was not dramatic about it. She was not cruel. She stated the facts with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed them until they were clean. She said, her late husband had established a trust with equal provisions for both his granddaughters. She said, an amendment to that trust had been filed after his death, bearing a signature that was not hers, authorizing a change she had never agreed to. She said, the funds intended for her older granddaughter had not been invested or lost, as that granddaughter had been told, but had been redirected, some to the younger granddaughter's education, some to personal use by the trustee. She did not use the word forgery, but she said clearly, that signature was not mine. The room was absolutely still. My father stood up. He said her name. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, a fracture running through the center of it, not yet a break but close. Mom, he said, using the word reflexively, addressing her the way he addressed my mother in moments of stress. What are you? This isn't the place. I know it isn't, Eleanor said calmly. But I've tried to find the right place for 3 months and I couldn't find one, so this will have to do. I stood up. I don't remember making the decision to stand. I was simply standing with the folder in my hands, and the room's attention had shifted to me, and my father's face had done something I had never seen it do before. It had gone uncertain. Genuinely, completely uncertain. Not the performance of uncertainty that people use when they're caught, the real thing. The face of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on is not solid. I have the original trust documents, I said. I have the amended document. I have the withdrawal records. And I have a forensic comparison of the signature on the amendment against verified samples of my grandmother's actual handwriting. I set the folder on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. Dad, I said. I don't need to go through every document here. You know what they show. His face. I will not describe it extensively, because some things are private even in moments of reckoning, and what crossed my father's face in that moment was something close to grief. The grief of someone who has built a structure of lies over a decade and is watching it collapse in a room full of people who trusted him. He sat down. He put his face in his hands. My mother was standing at the side of the room. She had gone very still, the stillness of someone who understands they are in the proximity of something catastrophic and has not yet determined where to place themselves. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name, something between shock and the particular guilt of someone who didn't commit the act but watched it happen without intervening. I did it for her, my father said. His voice was muffled, coming through his hands. Madison needed, she was going to school, and you said you were fine, you were always. I didn't say I was fine, I said. You decided I was fine. That's not the same thing. Madison had not moved from where she was sitting. Her face had gone through several transitions in quick succession: confusion, shock, the dawning comprehension of someone who is assembling information they hadn't had. She looked at our father. She looked at me. "What is she talking about?" she said, addressing no one specifically. "What did you do?" My father couldn't answer her. One of his colleagues, a man I'd seen at holiday gatherings for years, someone I'd always understood to be a close friend of my parents, quietly picked up his jacket from his chair and set it over his arm. He didn't leave immediately, but the gesture was legible. A professor from Madison's program exchanged a look with another professor. The social temperature of the room dropped several degrees in the space of 30 seconds. Aunt Helen had moved to stand near Eleanor, one hand on my grandmother's shoulder. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in a way that looked, to me, less like stoicism and more like the exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down. I picked up the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech. "I'll be contacting you through a lawyer," I said to my father. "I wanted you to understand that I know." That's all this was. I walked over to my grandmother and kissed her cheek. I found Jake near the back of the room. He had come with me, quiet and present in the way I needed him to be, and I took his hand and we walked out. Behind me, I heard Madison's voice rise in a question she was directing at our father. I heard my mother say something in the low, controlled tone she used for damage management. I didn't hear my father's response. Outside, the evening air was cool and carried the smell of cut grass from the park across the street. I stood on the sidewalk and let myself breathe. I understood then that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay. I had been paying that cost for 10 years without knowing it. But I was done. Jake stood next to me without speaking. After a moment, he took my hand again. "Okay," he said. "Getting there," I said. The legal process was slower and quieter than the confrontation had been, which is how legal processes tend to go, less dramatic, more grinding, structured around paperwork and meetings in offices with fluorescent lighting. My father hired an attorney. There was a brief period of denial, his lawyer raising procedural objections, questions about the authenticity of the forensic signature analysis, suggestions that the amendment had been executed in good faith based on what the trustee understood about my educational plans. David Brennan met each of these arguments with the specific patience of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has seen all the strategies before. The forensic comparison of the signature was the difficulty they couldn't overcome. It had been performed by a specialist David had engaged, using multiple verified samples of Eleanor's handwriting from estate correspondence, personal letters, and legal documents spanning 40 years. The analysis was thorough, documented, and, as the specialist noted in the report, not particularly ambiguous. The signature on the amendment was a copy, not an original. The slight variations in stroke initiation, letter spacing, and pressure distribution were consistent across the forged document and inconsistent with my grandmother's established patterns. My father's attorney eventually made a different kind of call. 6 weeks after the party, my father pleaded guilty to reduced charges, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent document execution. A full criminal forgery charge was negotiated down in exchange for a comprehensive restitution agreement and full cooperation. He agreed to a payment schedule covering the amount determined to have been diverted from my designated trust share, plus the $50,000 from the separate inheritance account. The figure was substantial. The payments would take years. He also, as a condition he had apparently added himself rather than being required to, wrote a letter. David's office forwarded it to me. It was 2 pages, handwritten, in the same careful script I associated with my father's work documents and birthday cards from childhood. He had clearly written multiple drafts. I could tell from the precision of it, the absence of crossed-out words, the sense that each sentence had been weighed. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself for years that I was capable enough to manage without the fund, that Madison needed it more, that the decision had come from love rather than malice, and that reading those justifications back to himself in the context of what had actually been done, they sounded as hollow as they were. He said he understood he had not only taken money from me, he had taken the version of my life I might have lived if the choice had been mine to make. He did not ask me to forgive him. I noted that and appreciated it more than most of what came before it. My mother's situation was more complicated and, in some ways, more difficult for me to resolve. She had not forged the signature. She had not executed the withdrawal. But she had known. That was clear from the timeline and from a conversation I eventually had with her, 6 weeks after the party, at a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground, her suggestion, which I found almost touching in its attempt at strategy. She told me she had found out approximately 2 years after the amendment was filed. My father had told her during an argument about something else entirely, the way significant truths sometimes emerge, sideways, from unrelated conflicts. She had been horrified initially. She had told him he needed to fix it. Then she had not followed up. She had accepted his assurances that it would be resolved eventually. She had watched the years pass. She had told herself, I think, that not actively participating in the deception was different from enabling it, but she had also benefited from it, lived in the renovated house, accepted the financial stability that had partly been built from funds that weren't theirs. I was afraid, she told me at the coffee shop, looking at her cup. I was afraid of what it would mean for the family. For him. For Madison. Madison didn't know, Kora. I promise you she didn't know. I believe you, I said. And I did believe that about Madison. But you could have told me, I said. At any point in the last 10 years, you could have told me. She didn't have an answer for that. She cried quietly in the way she had always cried, carefully, without losing control. I watched her and felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction at her distress, not lingering anger, but a kind of profound tiredness. The tiredness of someone who has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for an acknowledgement that finally arrived too late to change anything. I love you, she said. I want you to know I love you. I know, I said. I think that might be the saddest part. Madison called me 10 days after the party. She had clearly been processing everything in the way she processed things through action, through gathering information, through talking to people who could help her understand the shape of what had happened. She sounded smaller on the phone than she had in years. The particular smallness of someone who has been stripped of an easy self-narrative. She said she hadn't known. She had believed what she was told, that the trust had been restructured based on academic need, that it was handled correctly, that everything was above board. She said she felt sick. She said she was starting her own repayment commitment, smaller than our father's, because she was just beginning her career, but real. I know it doesn't change anything, she said. It changes something, I said. Not everything, but something. We didn't fall back into easy sisterhood overnight. That would have been the falsely comforting version of the story. But we began talking again, carefully, like two people who understand they are building something from different materials than before. She started therapy. So did I, eventually, not because I was falling apart, but because I recognized that the particular armor I'd spent a lifetime building was also, in some ways, a cage, and I was interested in figuring out what was inside it. The Thomas Education Initiative, the Veterans Mentorship Program I'd been building slowly and carefully for 2 years, had been running on a shoestring from my own savings. With the first installment of the restitution, I was able to do something I'd only planned in theory: formalize it, hire a part-time coordinator, expand the curriculum, and offer stipends to veteran participants who couldn't afford to take unpaid time for professional development. Jake helped me with the launch event. He stood in the back of the room the way he always stands, present, undemonstrative, occasionally smiling. When I gave the opening remarks, I talked about what the program was for, about the veterans who came home and had to rebuild from scratch, about the gap between service and civilian life that no one prepares you for adequately. I didn't mention my family, but I thought about them. I thought about the fact that something which had been taken from me had eventually, through a winding and painful road, arrived as mine, differently shaped, later than it should have been, but real. I thought about my grandfather, who had set the original trust up with the specific intention that his granddaughters would have choices. He had wanted to give me options. I was using them, just 10 years late. My relationship with my parents has settled into something I can only describe as bounded. My father I see rarely. The conversations are short, careful, not cruel but not warm. He has continued his restitution payments consistently, which is something. He has not tried to return to the version of himself that existed before the party, which tells me, perhaps, that he understands that version is no longer available. My mother I see slightly more often. Something in me can't quite let go of the history, the childhood, the particular texture of the relationship we had before I understood its full complexity. But I don't pretend that it is what it was, because it isn't, and pretending serves neither of us. Eleanor I visit every 2 weeks. She has recovered something in the months since the party, not youth, but a lightness I hadn't seen in her for some time, the lightness of someone who has put down a weight. She asks about Jake with the barely concealed enthusiasm of a grandmother who has decided she approves. She shows me her garden. She tells me stories about my grandfather that I hadn't heard before, small ones, the kind that don't make it into eulogies but make a person real. Jake and I don't put too many labels on what we are. We're careful with each other in the particular way of two people who have both survived things and understand that care is more sustainable than intensity. He asked me once, early in the summer, what I wanted. Not from him specifically, from everything. I thought about it for a while. To build something that lasts, I said. To make choices that are actually mine. He nodded like that made perfect sense. I believe it does. The last thing I want to say about my father is this: I understand, in a way I couldn't have in the immediate aftermath, how someone tells themselves a story about what they're doing that masks what they're actually doing. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal from his daughter. He made one decision. Then he made another decision to cover it. Then he made another to sustain the cover. Each one felt, I imagine, slightly less catastrophic than the one before, not because it was, but because the mind becomes expert at maintaining the narrative it has chosen. I made my own version of that error. I maintained the narrative that my parents were fundamentally trustworthy. I made it easier for them to deceive me by never verifying, never questioning, never taking the path that would have led me to David Brennan's office at 18 instead of at 28. My blind spot was not stupidity. It was the particular failure of trust that looks, for a long time, like loyalty. What I know now, standing in my apartment on an October morning with the window open and coffee going and Jake asleep in the next room, I am not the accumulation of what was done to me. I am, in some real sense, what I chose to do with it. That is not a slogan. It is a conclusion that cost a great deal to arrive at. But it holds. The cruelest thing Richard Thomas did was not forge the signature. It was tell his daughter she was strong. Strength, in this family, was the language of dismissal. It meant you can be overlooked without consequences. It meant your needs are less urgent than your sister's. It meant we don't have to explain ourselves to you because you'll survive regardless. For 28 years, Kora absorbed this framing and, because she is genuinely capable, made it true, which only reinforced the very dynamic that made the theft possible. This is the particular architecture of favoritism when it operates at the financial level. It doesn't require cruelty in every moment. It requires only the consistent quiet message that one child is the investment and the other is the outcome. Madison was the investment, the one for whom resources, attention, and protection were mobilized. Kora was the outcome, living proof that the family produced capable individuals, which required nothing further. What no one in this family, including Kora, examined carefully enough was the difference between being capable of surviving without something and consenting to go without it. Those are not the same. Kora had never agreed to give up her inheritance. She had simply never been given the conditions to know she needed to object. The forgery itself reveals something important about Richard's psychology. He did not structure the deception carelessly. He waited until after his father-in-law's death, when the emotional rawness of grief would discourage scrutiny. He filed the amendment with his attorney of record, David Brennan, but did not involve David directly in the signature, which suggests he understood the line he was crossing. He used legal infrastructure to commit an illegal act, which is perhaps the most telling detail. This was a man who believed the form of legitimacy could cover the absence of it. Patricia's role is, in some ways, the more disturbing one precisely because it is more common. She learned the truth 2 years in and did nothing. She had the opportunity to intervene quietly, privately, without a confrontation, and she chose the comfort of the existing structure over the obligation of honesty toward her older daughter. The renovation was beautiful. The family dinners were pleasant. The social image held. These are not negligible things, and to simply condemn Patricia without understanding the gravitational pull of them is to underestimate how powerfully humans will rationalize inaction when action carries a price. But the price of her inaction was paid by someone else. That is the moral accounting she has not yet fully settled. Madison's position is worth examining too, because she represents something the story might otherwise flatten: the beneficiary who is not guilty and is nonetheless complicit in an outcome. She didn't choose favoritism. She didn't know about the forgery. She simply received what she was given, the way we all receive the conditions of our upbringings, and built a life from them. The horror on her face at the party was, I believe, real. So was the shame. The question her situation poses is whether ignorance of injustice excuses participation in its benefits, a question she is, to her credit, attempting to answer through her restitution commitment and therapy. What the story ultimately says about trust is something this: trust that is never tested is not actually trust. It is assumption. Kora assumed her parents were operating in good faith, and in doing so, she provided the environment in which they could not. The failure was not in the trusting. The failure was in treating trust as a static condition rather than something that requires, occasionally, verification. The moment Jake asked whether Eleanor had actually agreed to the trust amendment, a question so simple that it seems, in retrospect, like it should have occurred to dozens of people years earlier, was the moment the entire structure became visible. Not because the question was brilliant, but because no one had thought to ask it. Sometimes exposure doesn't require a grand investigation. It requires one person willing to say the obvious thing out loud. What stays with me most, thinking about this story, isn't the money. It's the decade of a life shaped around a lie she didn't know was there. Kora made her choices: military service, project management, the slow, careful building of a mentorship program, and those choices were genuinely hers. She is not less for the road she walked. But there is something worth sitting with: the version of her life that existed in her grandfather's original trust document, the one with options rather than only survival. She never got to choose between them. We talk a lot about resilience, as if it's an uncomplicated virtue. But resilience that has been required of you, resilience that fills the space left by someone else's failure to protect you, is a different animal from the kind you choose freely. Kora was strong. She was always strong. But strength that is demanded is not the same as strength that is offered. And she deserved to have been offered something first.